everybody. My name is Dominic Kemps, and welcome to this next session where we're going to be talking about HIV cure, and particularly in the context of sub-Saharan Africa and how do we get cure into resource-limited settings. So we have a brilliant, passionate, exciting panel that includes Michael and Jen here, but also we'll soon join by Sisi and Moses in Uganda. Unfortunately, as you're all aware, there have been some visa issues in terms of getting people into the country. But what we wanted to do today, it's really informal, and we're going to try and keep the discussions short. Nobody has any PowerPoints. Their personalities are big enough to fill this room. So what we're going to do is hopefully set up some conversations around cure and what each of them are doing around cure, and then hopefully that will lead into a discussion which we can all participate. So the first thing I wanted to ask, though, is just get a sense of what people think of cure in the room. I don't know if you've attended any of the other cure sessions that we saw at the pre-conference, or yesterday there was an Africa research-focused cure session in the afternoon. And we've heard in each one of those sessions that communities are essential to the development of cure, that we need to engage communities in cure processes. But we haven't actually defined what that means. It's almost like people magically think if you create a space for community, then they will magically be able to contribute in a real and productive way. And that's one of the things that we want to pick out today. But before we get into that, let me ask a couple of questions. Yes and no questions. If you're going to answer yes, please stand up. If your answer is no, just stay seated. Just want to get a sense of some of the opinion in the room. Do you think that we will achieve some idea or a product that we can call a cure that might be a very, very long remission, several years, or eradication of the disease? But do you think we will achieve that in our lifetime? Yes or no? Okay, so hands up, stand. Okay, good. So there's a lot of optimism in the room. That's great. That's good. I'm really sorry for everybody online. I don't know if you can see the audience, but probably about 70% of people have stood. So there's a lot of positivity there. For those of you in the room, have you heard of cell and gene therapies? Yes, no? Ooh, okay, so about half of the room put their hand up or stood up. Okay. Good, good. You will be learning about it if you haven't heard about it or you don't know much about it today. And then finally, do you think, because I've said this is going to be focused on resource-limited settings, on Africa, and we keep on saying we want Africa to lead. We want African institutions to be part of these processes. Do you think the capacity exists today for African institutions to be leading in the development of cure and cure processes? Ooh. So in the room, there are about 5 hands up. So great, thank you for participating. I'm hoping that some of your opinions might shift as we go through the day today, that there is actually a lot of optimism in terms of what may be achieved in the next generation in terms of cure, but also in terms of the role of Africa. And I hope when we get into the discussion, we can get into a discussion about what we in the developed world can learn from Africa and vice versa. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my first presenter, Jen. Jen Adair is from the Fred Hutch in the Pacific Northwest. An esteemed professor. She does everything. She's brilliant. She recently trekked to Everest Base Camp. I don't think she's going to be talking about that today, but she's going to talk to us a little bit about her work around HIV cure and particularly gene therapy. Jen, over to you.
Thanks, Dom, and welcome to all of you. I want to take a brief second to acknowledge that Indigenous people had to give up their land unwillingly in order for me to be able to talk here, not just in Seattle where I practice my research, but also here where I get to share it with all of you. I also want to say, let's just call out the elephant in the room. You get to see 2 white people sitting on stage and 2 Africans on a screen because of the visa denials. And that is a fantastic example of the inequity that exists in this space, and we have a lot of work to do. So I'm going to continue with the survey theme. I need to ask, how many of you in the room think that we already have a cure for HIV? And you can raise your hand or stand. One hand is 2 hands, 3 raised in the room. The answer is yes and no. We have cured people of an HIV infection. They do exist. The reason the answer is no is because this is a cure that's not available to everyone, and it will not be available to everyone. Now, I said people, implying plural. Can you show me with your fingers how many people you think have been cured of HIV? 5, 5, 5, 5, 4, 4, 4, 4, 2, 3 in the background there. It's 5. You're going to hear about a 5th. There was a news announcement the day before the conference announcing the 5th. This is great news. But we have to talk realistically about what it took to achieve those cures. All 5 people who have been cured of HIV had essentially the same strategy applied to them. And it was not because they were living with HIV. It was because they were diagnosed with something else. Does anybody want to yell it out? Cancer. They received a treatment for their cancer, but some clever researchers and physicians had an idea about how they could execute that treatment in a way that might cure their HIV. Now, the treatment they received is called a bone marrow transplant. The cancer that they had was a cancer in their blood primarily. So in this type of treatment, the blood of the person with cancer is eradicated, either with chemotherapy drugs or radiation of the whole body, and it's replaced with blood from a healthy person. Basic research in HIV has taught us that there are people walking around the planet who can be resistant to HIV infection. People that we know have been exposed, but they never test positive. It's actually not a small number in terms of what gives them that resistance. And it just so happens that for these 5 people, a healthy person who matched their blood type happened to also have this natural resistance in their blood. And that was the transplant that those people living with HIV received. The chemotherapy and radiation and the need to have another healthy person who's born with that resistance that matches you are all of the reasons why this is not going to work for everyone. The most important of those is that the treatment itself, the transplant, is very toxic. It's not safe to do in people who don't have cancer. But we now know that this strategy can work. So what if we didn't have to do a bone marrow transplant? What if we didn't need some other healthy person? What if we could take the blood cells of the person living with HIV and just introduce the same changes that those lucky resistant people were born with? That might be a way for us to achieve the same effect, the same cure in people without having to put them through the toxicity and the trauma of a bone marrow transplant, and they wouldn't need cancer to be eligible for it. That's the basic idea behind gene and cell therapy. Now, I will say that's not the only idea people have. There are, as much as we learn about the biology of HIV and how it hijacks our cells to do what it wants to do, we come up with other strategies that could be used in the cell and gene therapy space to combat this infection. Anybody have a guess how many clinical trials for cell and gene therapy to potentially treat HIV infection are happening right now? Do you think you can say on one hand? Do you think you could say on 2 hands? I see 10 in the back. What about 2 hands and 2 feet? What if I told you it was even more than that? It's almost 40. There's a lot happening in this space right now. But just look at all of you who are attending this conference, and we didn't all have the same information about how many people had been cured. We didn't necessarily all have the same information about how we got to those cures and why they won't work for everyone else. Not everyone in the room stood up when we said cell and gene therapy was an option. When we talk about community engagement, we have to think about how do we start this conversation now? And very meaningfully, how do we include our partners in sub-Saharan Africa who need to be the ones that are also developing these therapies and presenting it to their own patients? It should not be someone like me standing in a room full of African patients living with HIV saying, we have a cure for you. It should be someone like Dr. Sissy Kitio, who you're going to hear next. This is a journey. It's a lot. We have to think about engaging conversations. You're going to hear from a community advocate in Seattle, Michael Luella, my colleague sitting behind me. The idea of this panel was to present a US scientist and a US community advocate from the same city who've had a longstanding relationship, juxtaposed with a Ugandan physician scientist and a Uganda community advocate who have also had a very longstanding relationship in this space. And we're going to talk to you about what has worked and what has not worked and what we have learned. As Dom said, we talk a lot about including community. Researchers like me can make spaces at our table, but think about what it would mean to be a community member walking into a room full of people with white coats and PhDs and MDs who are talking this incredibly high language. It's about as terrifying as a researcher like me walking into a community advocate space and saying, what can I do better? And both things have to happen. So just very briefly, I'm going to highlight a little bit of my experience in Seattle, talk about some of the lessons that I learned. Number one is that you have to have an engaging discussion with your audience. It cannot be me standing at the podium with slides, talking about stuff, and then just hoping you'll ask questions later. In addition to that, what I present needs to be at the learning level of the person with the lowest learning level in the room. Not the PhD or the MD PhD or the politician or anybody else with the highest professional or degree or position. Because when you make sure that every person in the room has the option to understand, then people get to direct their learning in the direction that they want to go. And it is a journey. Sometimes that journey may be a few minutes long with an individual person. Other times it's going to be decades long. You have to treat each one with humility and urgency and respect. We in the United States are fortunate to have access to a lot more therapies than our partners in Uganda have access to. One of the most impactful community relationships I've had, aside from Michael, is with another Indigenous person in the Seattle area who tested positive for HIV decades ago, who has been through some pretty significant trauma, both related and unrelated to his HIV status, is an advocate for clinical trials, but has never been permitted to participate in one because of comorbidities associated with his HIV diagnosis. And when we think about cure, one of the things I want to bring up is that this is an individual who openly will let you know his survival to this point means he has outlived 7 support groups. And we talk about cure and we want to have hope about it, but we have to be realistic that there are going to be a whole new set of social issues that happen when we start to achieve this in even tens of patients, let alone millions. Social, psychosocial research needs to happen now. We have to have social support for these groups now. And we have to think about what is going to change. Just like the face of HIV has changed in the last 4 decades. Now, look at the youth pavilion. How many people born with HIV? Just as that landscape is changing, as we start to implement cure, what will happen to that community? What happens to people living with HIV who identify as part of that community but then become cured? Timothy Ray Brown, the first patient who achieved a cure, received a letter that his housing support was going to be taken away because he was no longer positive. We also have to think about how the impact of achieving that medical advance changes the social aspects of individuals' lives. That is just a little bit of my experience. I am going to turn over to my colleague, Sissy Kitio, who's going to be online. I met Sissy in 2020 when she found me because of things I put online about my passion for making community engagement and cell and gene therapy work. And we've been working together since 2020. I don't even know how many studies we've published together now, but it's been an incredibly awesome relationship. And the thing I'm most excited about is how I get to see another passionate researcher implementing community engagement and a desire for these kinds of therapies in a completely different geographical setting with very different social issues to keep in mind. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sissy.
Thank you, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good evening over here in Uganda. And I'm very delighted to be part of these discussions in the Global Village. I hope you can hear me. First of all, I would like to just touch a bit on the historical perspective of where we've come from with HIV. Among one of the leaders in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of treating HIV patients. And we started this in 1992. And we were the first PEPFAR grantee institution, and we rolled out antiretroviral therapy in Uganda, but also supported many other countries in the region. So we saw a revolution in the management of HIV because before we had so many deaths, so many children being born with HIV. And now we saw people living and going back to work. So we are very excited about where we are, how far we have come today. But we've been hearing stories about cures. I think Jen talked about them 5 for now. And I think we are still counting. She talked about 40 gene therapy trials. None of them has happened in sub-Saharan Africa. And yet sub-Saharan Africa has 67% of the HIV burden in the world. So this is why, as leaders in HIV care, but also research, I reached out to Jen. And this is how we developed or formed what we call the Global Gene Therapy Initiative, which includes Jen, Michael, Moses, and many other scientists. And we are working together to make sure that this big gap of having gene therapy research and subsequently access in sub-Saharan Africa is closed. So we thank, and DOM, of course, is part of the Global Gene Therapy Initiative. We thank everybody who is supporting us. But as we move on this journey with a target to have the first trial by 2024, how are we working with community? And when we talk about community, community is varied. I have fellow scientists. They don't know about gene therapy because this is new. And there also still are many different communities where we have to educate and we have to move the same road through research to access. We had many groups, and we still have them, that advocated for HIV treatment access. And we had a whole campaign in the country called it Treat for Life. And we did not do it as scientists because we had now drugs funded by PEPFAR, by Global Fund. We used a lot of grassroots community organizations to help and support the access. Even to have people come out to test because now there was treatment. So the lessons we have learned from HIV, we can bring directly to gene therapy using the communities that we are working with. The first thing with the HIV treatment, it took 17 years for these very effective treatments to get to low and middle income countries. And Uganda, I will speak about Uganda specifically. So one thing we don't want to do is wait this long. And how did drugs move to Uganda or sub-Saharan Africa? It was a lot of advocacy by communities. So we are urging and engaging communities to make sure that the advocacy still remains very strong. Advocacy for funding, advocacy for research in our populations, and then advocacy for access. We talk about PEPFAR, Global Fund. PEPFAR, I think, provides over 60% of support in low and middle income countries for HIV treatment. But when we talk about treatment and epidemic control by 2030, that means we'll have lower new infections than deaths. But all the HIV patients, 38 million plus, will remain and they will need treatment, and that means money. So this is the advocacy for cure research and funding and access is really a business case, in that if you treat the HIV, then you do not need the drugs. And so advocacy should be pivotal for access, but also funding. But also, as we plan our trials in Uganda or other African countries, we need to engage the community. And as I said, the community is varied. It has people living with HIV. It has scientists themselves. It has politicians, because we have to have policies in the country. It has heads of states. So the communities are varied, but all of them have to be engaged in different ways, but systematically, to make sure that the goal of having our clinical trial is fulfilled. We have people to participate in trials. And a good example is way back in 1999, when we had the first HIV vaccine trial for prevention in Uganda. We had talked to participants for 2 years. The day before the trial started, there was a politician on radio saying Uganda is being used as guinea pigs. And we had 2 participants didn't turn up the following day because they listened to the politicians more than us, the scientists. So I think we need all the stakeholders around the table to understand where we are, to explain what gene therapy is, because there are a lot of myths, to explain what gene therapy is, to explain the benefits, to explain the business case, and bring everybody on board so that we can all be moving together to ensure that we have the first vaccine trial as already planned by 2024. Working with all these members who are on this panel in DDTI and many others who we are looking to for funding. I think I'll close it here, and I'm still online to answer any questions. Thank you. Back to you, Dom.
Okay, so thank you, Cece. So we kicked off here with 2 voices from world-class facilities here in the US, in the US and in Uganda, and now we're going to move to some community voices. And so I'd like to introduce Michael. Michael was also based up in the Pacific Northwest, part of the Defeat HIV CAB, and I think has been involved in every CAB of significance that I'm familiar with. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about his experience about how actually you can engage communities and how they can contribute to these processes.
Hello, my name is Michael. I've been working in the engagement of communities around HIV for 22 plus years. I started out as a front desk receptionist of an HIV research clinic, and I've moved into making it into a community engagement project management position because that's what was needed. I want to give you my philosophy of community engagement, and it's all around that word engagement, which all of my high school students, I used to be a high school English teacher, and that word engagement means something different in the real world as opposed to the HIV world. It means you're putting a ring on it. You're getting married. And that's exactly what community engagement is. And if you are a researcher in the room here, you are going to be marrying your community. You need to think of it as an engagement with all of the maintenance that that relationship requires. And you need to fund that. You don't want to be a cheapskate when it comes to your engagement. You want to have the best ring, don't you? You want to have all of the presents that you can bring to the wedding. You want to have a beautiful honeymoon. You want to do it like that. So please, when you think community engagement, think of just the word engagement and use that as your guide. You are marrying your community. You are marrying the specific parts of your community, and you want to feed that relationship that way. Now, most of my engagement before I got involved with the Martin Delaney Collaboratories was really cheap because we had no money for it. I was working through the AIDS Clinical Trials Group, and they didn't have any funding for community engagement. We had to cheat and steal and try to skimp it, and that fit in well with my past as a high school English teacher where I created a literary magazine on a photocopier. I was like, I'm used to that. I was never used to money. But that changed when I became a part of the Martin Delaney Collaboratories, and the two PIs that I worked for with Defeat HIV out of Fred Hutch, they told me to ask for everything I could possibly want. And to my honest surprise, since it was being funded through supplements, because they forgot to actually include that in the first iteration of the Martin Delaney Collaboratories, I got everything that I asked for, which is a blessing and a curse. But the money was there for me to all of a sudden do all of the things that I dreamed of. I could have money to put on big events. I could have money to do what I called small ambassador events, where I could go into the community and represent HIV cure talk and cell and gene therapy talk and have our cab form around sort of prosperous entity, as opposed to being always based on scarcity, trying to do things with no money. I had money for meetings. I had money to send my cab members to conferences like this. Two of them could go to IAS or could come to AIDS conferences. They could go to the Croy conferences without having to get a scholarship because I could pay for them just to go. It made the biggest difference because one of the problems with community engagement is that even when you get a wide community involved, are they going to be able to understand? And I can't tell you how many times I had community members come to our meetings and they feel like a 2x4 with on the head. It really was like that. It was like you were taking a 2x4 and you were just hitting yourself in the head with all the science. And the scientists trying to make it relatable really weren't doing a great job. And I told them, since I was married to them, to stick with it. I would make it work for them. I would find out what I could do to get that sort of understanding around this difficult science. And with cell and gene therapy, it was a double-edged sword. You had to talk about cure and the difficulties around cure, but then specifically, you had to teach them about bone marrow stem cell transplantation, as well as then what the heck gene therapy is and cell therapy and how that relates to it all. It was a lot for people who are just basically non-scientists to learn. And it took years of effort teaching. It's not something that's ever done once. So when I'm talking about the maintenance of a relationship, I'm talking about something that you are going to be doing for years. And that's what you are committing to. You don't want to get married just for a week, do you? You want to get married for a long time. I mean, maybe some of us want to get married for a week, but anyway, my community engagement became enriched, and I was able to do things like fly the Berlin patient, Timothy Ray Brown, and the German doctor who cured him to come to Seattle's public library and to talk about what they had done together. And that was great because then the library got involved and made that something that you could check out of the library, that whole recording that we did. It's a part of the Library of Seattle now. The public library system. We had lots of money to do things like that, to bring participants in cure trials and the scientists who did it, showing them as a team together, because really the science doesn't happen until you have participants in it. And so when you have participants who are willing to give blood, that's the birth of the engagement that you are looking for. And so it was always important to have those sorts of things represented. Being able to send people places and not have to worry about where you're going to get the money for doing that, to be able to have money, to have resources, to be able to do outreach and have swag. It was amazing. I felt like I was a part of a vaccine trial for the first time in my life, and I had all of this money to spare, which is showing you the difference between how the government looks at HIV vaccine work versus HIV cure. In other words, they know that people who are otherwise just HIV negative need to be convinced to get in trials, and they put tons of money behind that. We don't think of that for HIV positive people. We don't think that they need the same sorts of levels of education and swag to get them involved in cure research, but we do. We do. There's no other reason why except HIV stigma, why we don't think of it as, wow, people who live with HIV should be treated just like they treat the HIV negative participants of a vaccine trial. It should be the same. We should have the same amount of funds to be able to reach the communities that we want to reach. And it's probably the biggest thing that is lacking in any of our research when it comes to treatment or cure is fully funding community engagement. As someone who's now lived through that, I can say it honestly, it makes all the difference. Putting the money behind it, making sure that you know that the regulators and the funders are expecting to fully fund those things. We need to ask that. It can't just be coming from community asking that. We need the scientists to know to ask for that. You shouldn't be asking anything without, as what my teacher taught me, you want to ask with a full hand. You want to give as you're asking. You want to give as you're asking for things. So you want to make sure that you're always giving. You never ask with an empty hand where it's just all grab, 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 because then you're like Darth Vader trying to take over the galaxy, and you don't want to be that way. So I'm going to wrap it up there and let us go to Moses and to hear what he has to say about his community engagement, and then we'll get into some discussion, I think. But I thank you for your time, and I hope I reached you somehow to tell you that.
Thanks, Michael. And as we do get Supercharger connected, I just want to say, in 5 minutes, so we are going to switch to questions. So I've already seen the first few questions come online. I want you to be thinking about what your questions are for Jen, Michael, Cece, and Supercharger. Supercharger, are you with us? There he is.
Yes, Dom.
Go for it.
Hello, Dom. Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine.
Yes. This is Moses Supercharge, yeah? A person who has lived with HIV since 1994, and I really died to see an HIV cure because I've taken medications for a long time. And there are several reasons, like I keep repeating, why we want an HIV cure. We have so many folks who are running out of options. People have taken first line, second line, and they are on third line. They have no fourth line. So the cure is the only alternative. It's the only option for them. And I've taken medication personally for 3 decades, and I want to live up to 100 years. The concern is that these medications I'm taking every day are toxic. And my internal organs have been so good to me handling them for the last 3 decades. But the concern is that will these medications I take every day be able to take me another 50 years? So I look to an HIV cure as the solution, because like I keep repeating, I'm ready to stay here another 50 years. So I need a cure of HIV. Access to these medications, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is a challenge because of insecurity, infrastructure challenges. We have persistent stockouts of medications, especially in my country, Uganda, and we look to an HIV cure as the solution. But what needs to be done for this cure to come so fast and smooth? First and foremost, we need to forge more collaborations. Pharmaceutical companies need to collaborate more. Researchers need to collaborate more. We need funding, like Michael said, especially in Africa. We need funding, and when this funding comes, please include community advocates, community people to also get some kind of education about what's going on. Simplify the language, like Michael has said. we sit in conferences and we really take long to understand what you mean, because the cure language is so hard. Involve Africa. I really feel bad to hear that actually 40 trials are going on, 40 gene therapy trials are going on all over the world, but Africa is not included. We need to include Africa because majority of the people with HIV are in Africa. And these are the people who take on your cure when you discover it. Please train the research institutions, train the researchers in Africa, upgrade the laboratories in Africa. We have several laboratories in Africa, but we need more. So all rotates around funding and involvement. I'll stop there and maybe I'll take a question if it comes.
Thank you, Supercharger. Thank you. And thank you to all our speakers. And you know, we miss you, Supercharger. We miss you, CC. Having you here would have made all the difference. But I'm so pleased that you're able to join us online. So now it's actually over to you. This is a global visit session, and a global village is about engagement with communities. In Michael's parlance, we want to be married to you all. So please, over to you. Question first.
Krista from South Africa in the Fresh cohort in the Reagan Institute. This question is for Michael. Michael, I've had a glimpse of some of the Martin Delaney grants and groups who do have funding. There's a line item for community engagement. And I just wonder about who's going to be the Michael for the various different Martin Delaneys who know how to enter a marriage and maintain it well, rather than only sending a few representatives to a conference who don't get extra training, don't learn how to do public speaking, don't know how to use the money, even if it were given to them. But as you know, if you don't know how to use that money, if you don't know how to go into the community and have these groups, you won't even know what to do with that line item, nor to advocate for the money to come to you, and then it goes to the investigators. So where do we go from here with the different groups, whether it be pharma, whether it be big institutions, sponsors, Martin Delaney, whatever? How do they learn how to engage in a good marriage and maintain it?
Hello. Hi, that's a good question. I would say that the way, at least in terms of the specific Martin Delaney collaboratories, has tried to work on that issue is by building in a community partner that is equally funded as a part of the collaboratory. So instead of leaving it as an afterthought, they're supposed to have a community partner that is a community organization or someone who has that sort of footing in their community. So it's supposed to work that way. We're just starting it out, so it's a new experiment, so we don't know exactly yet. It's been 1 year. We don't know how that's working yet, but you can see it starting to gel in certain ways. So they're building it in with a community partner, and I would suggest that researchers think of that as a way of doing your research. In fact, research should never be just plain old research. You should always think of it as community-based, community participatory. Somehow you are you're co-creating your research. You never do it alone. You're never a researcher doing it alone. Always try to find a partner that you are doing it with, and a partner who's a non-scientific partner. In other words, you know, if you want to work in HIV, you should be thinking about who can be a partner outside of the scientists. So I think that's the way that you can start to at least build in specifically how the money that you ask for can be wisely used, because you're hopefully having a wise partner that's out in the community with years of experience to relay on.
Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I would just say one of, I think, the most beneficial relationship components, and yes, I married Michael, I think 7 years ago, in this partnership. We actually travel together to this conference. I brought Michael to a cell and gene therapy conference in May. And you don't just say, here's money, show up. You have to be there. You have to say, this is how this conference works. Michael told me, hey, there's going to be protests here. I was like, that was good to know, because it kind of took me by surprise, but I think it's really meaningful. Just like I was able to tell him, look, you're going to be incredibly disappointed when you go to the cell and gene therapy conference, because they do not include patients or community in any, they're treating hundreds of diseases and you won't see a patient there unless they happen to also be a researcher who's working in this space. None of the presentations are going to relate to community in a meaningful way. I've tried talking to that society. I've been on the board and tried to push them. One tactic that has worked was bringing Michael this year and teaching him, encouraging him, go up to the microphone and say that you don't understand what this means for the community of people living with HIV, and then back him up, high five him when he comes back to the seat, show everyone that as a scientist in the field, you respect that opinion and you want it to be addressed, and hold your groups accountable. When we talk about being married, that's the kind of involvement that it takes.
So if you may give me 1 second, we've got a question online that, Jen, since you have the mic, it'd be worth you answering. And so this is from Bethrida and Gosa from Zambia. And they're saying, because you mentioned that there are people who have been cured, so why can't you bring the cure to Africa now? Yeah, so the process that was used to execute those cures, I told you, was a bone marrow transplant. Bone marrow transplant to treat cancer by itself, whether or not HIV is present, is not a treatment that is widely available on the African continent. Some countries are starting to do it, but it's in the very early stages. One important thing that I think is worth mentioning, I mentioned that when you do a bone marrow transplant, you have to have a healthy person and the sick person, and you have to match their blood types to each other. That means that we have to have a registry of people whose blood types are already known, so that when a person gets cancer, we're not serving the entire country or continent to find that match. We already can pull it out of a database. Those registries need to be created in order to support that work as well. And in the last 10 years, a really important project that's related to all of this work called H3 Africa has been happening. This was sponsored again by the NIH, and the idea was to put the sequencing of African DNA and genomes into the hands of Africans. It will support creating bone marrow transplant registries. It also supports us understanding the genetic diversity of the continent. And one of the most important things we learned is that Africa is the most genetically diverse continent on the planet. That means that when we talk about genetic therapies, if we want to be real, you don't create a genetic therapy in a tiny population that has very similar genes and expect that it's going to go out into the world and work. You create the therapy in the place that has the most different genes in the most concentrated area, and then you have something that you're pretty darn sure can go anywhere else in the world and work. Gene therapy has been in development since 1990 and has yet to happen on the African continent, but now we know that that's where it should be happening. And there needs to be a push to make it go there. But again, that's going to require partnerships. I need to give all of the knowledge I have in cell and gene therapy to Dr. Kitio, because it needs to be her that's presenting it to her patients. This is a different way to kind of think about those partnerships, especially when we get to like the commercial level. Thanks, Jen. Jeff?
Yeah, hi, Jeff Taylor from the Reversing Immune Deficiency Collaboratory. And I'm like Michael, one of the community engagement coordinators, and there aren't enough of us. But one thing that's happened, we're now in the kind of the third cycle, 11 years in, is that they've nearly doubled the collaboratory from last time. So we've got new people in our position who don't know what they're doing. So our first job is to educate them and bring them up to speed. Not all of them are living with HIV. They've had other academic jobs and don't have the experience either with cure or with working with community in the way that we have. So we've got to educate them so they can do their jobs. And the other really important thing that we need to advocate for the next iteration of the Delaney Collaboratories is not just fund the community engagement partners here in the US, but identify African researchers and African community groups to do the same thing there that they're doing here. And it's been an uphill battle, as you said from the beginning. They didn't even think about having even a cab the first time. We had to say, excuse me, you named this after Martin Delaney, a famous community cure HIV activist. He didn't even have community at the table. He didn't even think about it in the grant. And they had to scramble to get money to do it. And so each time we do this, we need to keep doing it better. Every 5 years, we have an opportunity. And requiring them to have African partners and African community engagement partners is key.
Thanks, Jeff. Can I just want to build on Jeff's point, because I believe the relationship, Cece, that you built with Jen was as a result of a call late at night. And sometimes this conversation has been framed in terms of people in the North finding collaborators in the South, but actually it can happen the other way. And Cece, I don't know, maybe if you have some thoughts from your experience around how you reached out to Jen and how her response actually is maybe a best practice that others should be following when having conversations with researchers and potential collaborators in other parts of the world.
Yeah, thanks, Dom. And I think when we say the work or gene therapy research is not happening in Africa, so we should not be waiting for the people in the US to come to us. It is us as scientists, us as a community member in Africa where we have the biggest problem, we should reach out for our own people. So Glenn was not the first person I reached out to. I reached out to farmers who were already doing therapy research. I reached out to institutions. And then I think it was pure luck, but it was also because I was searching and looking and I was not going to stop. That's when I reached out to Jen. I found had the same passion for this work and wanted to do it outside the US. So I thank God that I found her, and that is how we formed the Global Gene Therapy Initiative. But as a practice, I think other scientists, as well as community members, including Moses. Now Moses is known in circles and they come to him. But I'm sure there are very many community advocates in Uganda who should be reaching out to learn from people like Michael and what they have done to really come married to the scientists. And we talk about the learning collaborative. The SCTG, Michael again talked about that. And if the community advisory boards were not there before, it was the advocacy of the community that made SCTG funding and support for community advisory boards. I think, again, this your work, Michael and others, to talk to NIH about engaging and incorporating community. And now, if you want funding for SCTG, society will not be funded if you don't have the community participation and engagement. But we also need to learn from you this marriage. Are we engaging the communities enough? And the other question that was asked in the room, are the community members that we are working with doing the right things, or is there some more training that needs to be done? Is there training that we need to do for advocacy? Or does someone just wake up, they are passionate about something and they go to advocate? We talked about public speaking. We need more people to stand up and even to have the courage to call someone who doesn't know you, and you try and call them. And then you're lucky when you get someone like Jen. How do you do?
Thanks, Cece. Karin?
Thank you. Jen, I want to commend all the work you're doing to go above and beyond as a biomedical researcher to really engage communities, and it's really a wonderful example to follow. I think Krista is a similar biomedical person who's really engaged communities and works very closely with communities, so kudos to you. But I do have some dilemmas that I'm seeing. Michael, the marriage that you're talking about is really contingent on funding cycles, right? Like I see this, we're married in a 5-year increment. So how do we create a sustainable community engagement infrastructure that can transcend those funding cycles? And what is our benchmark of community, patient, and stakeholder engagement in HIV cure-related research globally? We have wonderful, good participant practice guidelines for HIV prevention trials that were developed in the context of large-scale biomedical prevention. But we're talking about smaller
trials, the ethics of experimental medicine. It's almost like a remission model. So how do we adapt the tools that we have to HIV cure and engage communities around treatment interruptions and everything that cure-related research comes with? And the last dilemma I have is back to something that Jeff talked about. If we want to engage community, we also have to value the time of community members. If we want diversity, equity, inclusion, we need to be able to compensate our community members to enable them to be able to participate and have a seat at the table. So I think we need to advocate together. It would be wonderful to see in the ACTG what we have in the MDC, the Martin Delaney Collaboratories, because the clinical trials are happening in the ACTG. So we need to be able to recruit and engage otherwise healthy volunteers. So kudos to all the efforts you've done to try to make this happen, and anything we can do to support you, let us know.
Well, I want to say, first of all, that indeed it's a problem that I'm facing right now. I have no more funding. All of the past 5 years were well funded, and now it goes zip away. And I'm dealing with community members that are saying now, what, we just stop? And that's because the funding has stopped. Yes, we just stop. And that system works for scientists, perhaps, in terms of ways that we fund research projects, but it doesn't work for continuous engagement. And I think we need to ask the NIH to fund community engagement in a different way than they fund the engagement of scientists or the work of the scientists. We need to have something that is continuous, that doesn't depend upon someone getting a research grant. The ways that we engage community can be done that way. We need a Institute of Community Engagement, and it needs to be called NICE, the National Institutes of Community Engagement, and you can call it NICE. And it needs to happen. It needs to happen. We need to have that sort of commitment level where we have a funding mechanism from the NIH that is about continuous engagement around the world as well as around the country of the US. Imagine if you had that sort of levels of engagement that was constant, and you could have all of the different types of work that is done biomedically through the NIH funded through that mechanism. So you have constant community engagement and science and biomedical research, no matter if it's HIV or if it's cardiovascular or if it's cancer, you're funding it that way. I think that's what we need NICE for. I'd also say there was another part that you brought up, Corinne, and I can't remember exactly what it was now. You were talking about the time limits, and then you brought up another point, and I can't remember. TPP? No, there was something else I wanted. GPP. Oh, because we don't do that, and it was with the ACTG. If you think about it, the ACTG does not have community engagement. It does not have a community engagement branch. It doesn't do it like the HVTN or HPTN, who would never think about doing any research study without having a well-organized, centralized community engagement effort that then funds all of its sites to have community engagement officers that respond to directly. We don't do that with treatment. And I think that just goes back to the days where why were people supposed to get involved in treatment research? Because they were going to die. Death was the engine of our recruitment, and that was shocking to realize, but then it became about access. When we had treatments and people needed to get on treatments and they didn't have health care, what they did is they went into these naive trials, these large treatment naive trials, and that's how we got people engaged. But now that we're talking about cure and it's dependent upon altruism, you can just hear the trombone going, wah, wah, wah. Because the previous ways that we engaged people, which was through death and then through treatment access, don't work when it's altruism. And that's what we're actually seeing in terms of how hard it is to recruit for these trials. So that was the other part I wanted to bring up. Why we let the ACTG get away with not having any community engagement that is centrally located and goes through all 36 clinical trials is beyond me, but it seems like the government is happy to do so.
I would just throw in, we're talking a lot about the National Institute of Health, which is specific to the United States. There are two initiatives that we need to think about. One is impressing upon the NIH how important it is to allow subawards from that funding to go to other countries to support community engagement and other awards. And we also need to think more critically about how we implement similar funding paradigms in other nations. We got to be part of a CURE conference the day before this meeting started. And I learned something that day that I thought was actually kind of sad. It's that greater than 90% of the funding towards worldwide access to antiretroviral treatments and PrEP and prevention strategies comes from the United States. We can't bear that financial burden. Other high-income countries have to step up. In addition to that, we have to think about how we're going to implement sustainable economic structures to support such things in nations that are considered low and middle income countries. I'll give you one example. My interaction with CICI just in the first 6 months taught me something really fascinating. In the United States, I have a gene therapy trial. I go to a set of my peers, I get funding from the NIH, and then I go to the Food and Drug Administration, and they tell me whether or not the trial can go forward. And when they sign off, the trial starts. In Uganda, there's a similar setup, but the final sign-off doesn't come from the drug authority. It comes from the president of the country. Can you imagine if Trudeau in Canada or Biden in America had to sign off on every clinical trial that we ran? All of a sudden, the incentive is different, right? It's about, will this hurt or help my next political stretch? But we have to approach those economies and those structures differently.
Thanks, Jen. And so we are reaching the end of this, but we've got one more question in the room. Jackie, online, I will summarize your question, and I'm going to ask all the presenters to prepare one 15-second insight takeaway that they want people online and in the room to leave. But please, over to you.
Thank you. I'm Nina. I'm from the Netherlands, and I'm from the NL for Cure consortium, working on building a linking and learning platform to communicate structurally about HIV cure developments. And I was wondering, part of the question has already been slightly answered about how we can convince biomedical researchers that structural engagement and systematic engagement is needed. And I was curious about your experiences, but you've already sort of covered it. My question for you is actually on community engagement, and because what I see sometimes is that there's a bit of a smaller group of community members who are mostly the most vocal ones, and within the community has of course different subgroups, and I was wondering about your strategies, how you worked with that, if you encountered it at all.
Michael, if you want to briefly go, and Supercharge, I'll come to you afterwards.
Yes, so trying to spread the wealth, so to speak, and make the knowledge base shared amongst many people is a slower process, I think. Again, we have people who are going to conferences, coming back and sharing it with themselves. So, like, in other words, not only were my community members going to a conference like this, but they would go back and I would have them teach their community members at home in Seattle the things that they've learned, building that sort of skill set. So I've had the community member that Jen mentioned earlier, who is an Indigenous person, was terrified the first time he had to speak in front, and he had everything written down and his paper was shaking. Now he is a public speaker, and guiding him through that process and helping give them skills that they need to do public presentations, to be able to speak and to be able to describe these things. That was partially also what I was funding when I asked for all that money.
Thanks, Michael. Is Supercharger online still? How do you... Oh, he's not online. Okay. So we've lost Supercharger. So then let me... We've got a minute left. And so Cece, Jen, Michael, thank you for your contributions today and the preparation and time. But as I mentioned earlier, there are 50-odd people online, there are 30-odd people in the room. What would be the key thing that you would want people to take away from your comments, the discussion today?
I'll be super fast. I think we have to fund community engagement. You have to understand that the barriers to community engagement are different for each individual in each community, and you need to meet with those communities and understand what those are. But we often talk about how we prepare community, scientists, clinicians, researchers. You have the money and the power in this space, and you need to also come to the table. You need to learn how to speak at a 5th grade level. You need to accept that you are not always the best representative for the population that you want to treat, and you need to start practicing how you engage so that you can learn by failure how to do it better.
Thanks. Michael?
I like the idea that I just came up with, NICE. I would love to see a National Institutes for Community Engagement, and I think we need to start asking for that. That's something that's funded differently. So my last words to you are NICE.
And Sissy, last comments to you. What is the one takeaway that you would want people to hear?
Thank you, John. The road to cure is long and it's going to be bumpy. So we had better tighten our seatbelts. For us scientists, we need to be advised by community on how to engage them better, how to provide information and educate. And then from the community perspective, of course, we want to round the table to advise us on what we doing, using best practices, whether from Africa or from the US, so that we eventually get married. And then
Thanks. Thank you, everybody. I'm sorry we ran out of time, but thank you again to our speakers, and thank you for making the time to join us.